Bonita Springs, Florida. A community known for its serene beaches, lavish homes, and an easy, comfortable life. The kind of place where nightmares feel like they belong somewhere far away. But on June 28, 2015, that illusion was shattered. And for one family, paradise became a living hell. Dr. Monique Carter was a woman of remarkable talent. A respected physician who made a name for herself by healing others. Her patients adored her. Her community admired her. And her family, they were supposed to be the ones who loved her the most. But as it turned out, love was not enough to keep her safe. She was found murdered in her own home. Brutally beaten to death with a hammer. 17 blows to the skull. It was a scene so violent, so unforgiving, that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the rage behind it. Everyone wanted answers. Who would want a woman like Monique Carter dead? And why? The investigation that followed would uncover a plot so cold, so calculated, it would leave even the most hardened investigators questioning their own sense of humanity. A plan driven by greed, desperation, and betrayal. And at the center of it all, the very man who vowed to love her for life. But how do you catch a killer when the mastermind is playing the victim? And how far would someone go to cover their tracks, when the truth is worth millions? Dr. Monique Carter was everything a community could hope for. In her mid-40s, she had built a reputation as a brilliant holistic physician whose work transcended traditional medicine. Her patients trusted her not only for her expertise, but for her warmth and genuine care. She wasn't just a doctor. She was a healer. And to those who knew her, she was a miracle worker. Her clinic in Bonita Springs was a sanctuary for those seeking hope and healing. People came from miles around just to see her. She would sit with them, listen intently, and somehow, always find the right words to calm their fears. Monique was a force of good. To everyone, it seemed like she had it all, a loving husband, 2 beautiful daughters, and a thriving career. But not all was as it seemed. Marcus Carter was her husband of 16 years. A businessman in his late 40s who, on the surface, played the role of the supportive spouse perfectly. To friends and family, Marcus was charming, confident, and devoted. But those close to Monique knew that their marriage was far from perfect. Marcus had built his life on status and wealth, but his business ventures had been crumbling beneath him. Debt was mounting, and the facade of his success was fading. It was a blow to his pride, something he couldn't accept. And as his failures grew, so did his desperation. He began to rely heavily on Monique's success to maintain his lifestyle. But for Marcus, that wasn't enough. He needed control. Control over his life, his finances, and most importantly, his marriage. Monique had confided in friends that their relationship had become strained, that Marcus was growing increasingly possessive. Arguments over money and his failed business attempts had become a common occurrence. She had even considered divorce. But Marcus wasn't about to let that happen. He couldn't afford to lose her. Not financially. Not emotionally. Not at all. And then, there was DeAndre Wallace. A man with a checkered past, hardened by years of violence and desperation. In his late 40s, DeAndre was the kind of man you wouldn't want to cross. He and Marcus had known each other since childhood, growing up in Missouri. Their bond had been forged through the rough edges of youth, but their paths had taken very different turns. For years, DeAndre had scraped by on petty crime, doing whatever he could to make ends meet. So, when Marcus reached out to him with an offer that would change his life forever, DeAndre didn't hesitate. The offer was simple, $100,000 to make sure Monique was taken out of the picture. Permanently. But DeAndre wasn't about to take on a job like this alone. He needed help. And that's where J.J. Rogers came in. A young man in his early 30s, known for being reckless and willing to do anything for fast money. J.J. had never been one to back down from a challenge, no matter how dark or dangerous it was. And the money Marcus was offering was more than enough to make him overlook the consequences. Bonita Springs was a place meant for peace and prosperity. A quiet, wealthy suburb with luxurious homes lining pristine streets. It was the kind of place where danger was only something you heard about on the evening news, never something that happened in your own backyard. But that illusion of safety was about to be torn apart. The plan was laid out with precision. Marcus would be out of town, visiting family with their daughters, creating the perfect alibi. DeAndre and JJ would handle the rest. The night of June 28, 2015, was just like any other in Bonita Springs. Quiet. Calm. But inside one particular house, chaos was about to unfold. A mother, a wife, a healer, about to face the most brutal betrayal imaginable. But what Marcus didn't count on was just how many mistakes were about to be made. And how those mistakes would unravel everything. For all her success and all the lives she had touched, Monique Carter's own life was slipping out of her control. The struggles within her marriage were no secret to her closest friends. Marcus's financial troubles had grown from a mere inconvenience to a crushing burden. His business ventures had failed spectacularly, leaving him desperate, angry, and slowly unraveling. Every argument seemed to circle back to money. Marcus's bitterness over his failed investments. His resentment that Monique was the primary breadwinner. His desperation to prove himself as a man who could provide. But the reality was harsh. His finances were wrecked, and he was leaning heavily on Monique's income to maintain their extravagant lifestyle. Monique had tried to be patient, tried to be supportive. But the resentment Marcus held against her only continued to grow. She had hinted more than once that she was ready to walk away. That maybe divorce was the only answer. But to Marcus, divorce wasn't just the end of his marriage. It was the end of everything. The house. The luxury. The status. And most importantly, the money. His obsession with control over Monique's life had become painfully obvious. And those closest to her had noticed. Monique confided in her friends that Marcus's behavior was growing more and more erratic. His temper flaring up over the slightest disagreement. His paranoia that she would leave him growing by the day. And his words, whenever they argued, becoming more and more chilling. She thinks she can just walk away from me? That's not how this works. Those were the words Marcus had spat out during one of their most heated arguments. The anger in his eyes had been something Monique had never seen before. It was a look that left her shaken, unable to sleep that night. And then, there was his trip to Missouri. On the surface, it appeared innocent enough. A visit to an old friend. But Marcus's visit to DeAndre Wallace wasn't about friendship. It was about something far darker. Marcus and DeAndre had spent hours talking, plotting. Their conversations were filled with instructions, numbers, and details meant to secure Marcus's freedom from the marriage that had become his own personal prison. And DeAndre, driven by greed and the lure of easy money, was more than willing to do Marcus's bidding. The trip wasn't just a casual meeting between two old friends. It was the beginning of something terrible. And Marcus knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone reckless, someone desperate, someone who wouldn't hesitate to do the unthinkable. That's when DeAndre brought in J.J. Rogers. A man known for his impulsiveness, his willingness to take risks others wouldn't dare to. DeAndre had promised him money, more money than he'd ever seen in his life. And J.J., without hesitation, agreed. But Marcus didn't realize that his desperation was already creating cracks in his plan. The calls. The meetings. The countless loose ends he had left scattered around. But in his mind, everything was under control. All he needed was for DeAndre and JJ to finish the job. Marcus had even taken precautions to make sure nothing could be traced back to him. His alibi was already in place. A family trip to Connecticut. His daughters laughing and playing, oblivious to the darkness their father was unleashing miles away. To the world, Marcus Carter was simply a husband and father on vacation. But to DeAndre and JJ, he was something else. He was their employer. Their partner in crime. The man who held the key to their fortune. And while Marcus waited comfortably in another state, confident his plan was falling perfectly into place, Monique was completely unaware of the danger lurking in her own home. The date was set. The instructions were clear. And Marcus believed he had covered every possibility. But what he didn't realize was that the very people he trusted to carry out his plan were already making mistakes. And those mistakes would be the cracks that would eventually bring everything crashing down. 2 men. A rented car. A plan set in motion. The countdown to murder had begun. Marcus Carter was desperate, and desperation had led him to make the worst decision of his life. He was ready to sacrifice his wife's life to solve his own problems. A $100,000 offer was made to DeAndre Wallace. The money would be paid once the job was done. For DeAndre, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. The payout was more than he could ever imagine. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. DeAndre reached out to someone who didn't ask questions, someone with nothing to lose. J.J. Rogers. Young, reckless, and driven by the need to make money fast. J.J. was the type of man who didn't care about consequences. All he needed was the promise of a hefty payday. And for Marcus, that made him the perfect tool. With Marcus pulling the strings from a distance, DeAndre and J.J. began planning. The trip from Missouri to Bonita Springs was mapped out. The supplies they needed were listed. It was all supposed to be quick. Clean. Over and done with before anyone could realize what had happened. But planning a murder wasn't as simple as Marcus had imagined. Mistakes were already being made, and he was too far removed from the operation to see it. DeAndre and J.J. arrived in Florida with one mission: kill Monique Carter. They rented a car, trying to blend in, pretending to be nothing more than travelers passing through. But that illusion would soon crumble. The first error came when they made their way to a local Walmart. It was late, and the store was quiet. But the surveillance cameras were anything but. They watched everything. DeAndre and J.J. walked through the aisles, grabbing what they thought they needed. Black towels. Gloves. A lockpicking kit. Supplies they believed would help them cover their tracks. But even as they tried to remain anonymous, the cameras captured their every move. They paid for the items in cash, hoping to avoid a paper trail. But what they didn't realize was that their faces had already been recorded. Their careless movements documented by the store's security system. Evidence was already building against them, and they were oblivious to it. But none of that mattered to them. They were only focused on one thing: getting the job done. June 28, 2015. The night Marcus had chosen. The night Monique would return home alone, believing her husband and children were safely away in Connecticut. Marcus had set everything up perfectly. His alibi was solid. His plan foolproof. At least, that's what he thought. DeAndre and J.J. parked their rental car a few blocks away from Monique's home. The darkness of the night offered them the cover they needed. They approached the house, their adrenaline pushing them forward. Everything had led up to this moment. But even then, mistakes were being made. Their rental car, a vehicle meant to be discreet, was equipped with GPS tracking. Their path from Missouri to Bonita Springs was being recorded, a digital footprint they didn't even consider. Inside the house, DeAndre and J.J. prepared themselves for what had to be done. The plan was simple. Quick. Brutal. They waited, their patience tested by the ticking of the clock. And then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Monique Carter had arrived home. Completely unaware of the danger waiting for her just beyond her front door. Marcus had assured them it would be easy. He had assured them there would be no witnesses. And in that moment, they believed him. They had no idea that everything was already starting to fall apart. It was late when Monique Carter pulled into the driveway of her Bonita Springs home. The air was still, the neighborhood silent. Marcus had made sure his alibi was airtight, far away in Connecticut with their daughters. Everything about that night had been planned to perfection. At least, that's what Marcus believed. But the truth was, nothing about this was perfect. And what was about to happen would leave more traces than any of them could imagine. Monique stepped out of her car, tired from her flight but relieved to be home. She unlocked the door, her thoughts still on her work, her patience, the life she was trying to build despite the turmoil within her own marriage. She walked inside, closing the door behind her. The house was dark. Quiet. Just how she left it. But she wasn't alone. DeAndre Wallace was waiting in the kitchen. His breathing shallow, his nerves twitching with anticipation. J.J. Rogers was hidden in the hallway, his hands shaking as he tried to keep himself calm. They had been waiting for hours. Waiting for the moment they could finally finish what Marcus had paid them to do. Monique made her way through the house, unaware of the danger lurking within. Her heels clicking softly against the tile floor, each step bringing her closer to the nightmare waiting to unfold. And then it happened. As Monique entered the kitchen, DeAndre stepped forward. His eyes cold. His grip on the hammer steady. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Confusion washed over Monique's face. But there was no time for questions. The first strike came fast, brutal. A sickening thud that echoed through the quiet house. Monique's body crumpled to the floor. But DeAndre didn't stop. The blows kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. 17 strikes. Each one more vicious than the last. JJ stood in the hallway, his eyes wide, his body frozen as he watched the attack. He had agreed to be a part of this, but even he hadn't expected the sheer brutality of what he was witnessing. But the job wasn't over. As DeAndre stepped back, his breathing ragged, JJ snapped back into action. They had to clean up. Cover their tracks. JJ grabbed a towel and began wiping down the surfaces, his hands moving frantically, his mind racing with panic. He wiped door handles, countertops, anything he thought they might have touched. But in his rush, he was already making mistakes. Missing spots. Leaving traces. And the more he tried to cover his tracks, the more careless he became. DeAndre, his adrenaline still pumping, checked to make sure Monique was dead. The sight of her lifeless body on the kitchen floor was all the confirmation he needed. They had done it. The job was finished. And all they had to do was leave. But as they fled the scene, their panic only grew. They had parked the rental car too close. They hadn't covered their faces properly. And they had underestimated just how much evidence could be left behind. The plan was supposed to be simple. Kill Monique. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Walk away and collect the money. But nothing about that night was simple. And as DeAndre and JJ sped away from the house, their nerves rattled, their hands still stained with Monique's blood, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. What they didn't realize was that their mistakes were already piling up. And the trail of evidence they left behind would be their downfall. The morning of June 29th, 2015, began like any other in Bonita Springs. The sun rose over the peaceful suburb, and life continued as usual. But for Dr. Monique Carter, there would be no new day. Her colleagues at the clinic noticed her absence almost immediately. Monique was nothing if not punctual. And when she didn't answer calls or messages, concern quickly turned into panic. It was out of character for her to be unreachable. One of her closest friends, also her business partner, made the call to the police. When officers arrived at Monique's home, nothing seemed out of place from the outside. The door was locked. The house appeared undisturbed. But when they entered, everything changed. They found Monique's lifeless body crumpled on the kitchen floor. The scene was a blood-soaked nightmare. Her head had been crushed beyond recognition, the brutality of the attack unlike anything they had seen before. Whoever had done this hadn't just intended to kill her. They intended to destroy her. Initially, the police believed it was a home invasion gone terribly wrong. But as they looked around, something didn't add up. Nothing of value was missing. Monique's purse was still there. Her jewelry untouched. Even her expensive electronics remained exactly where she left them. If this was a robbery, then why hadn't anything been taken? The thought lingered in the minds of the detectives as they continued to process the scene. Everything about the crime felt off. Like it was meant to look like something it clearly wasn't. But the real breakthrough wouldn't come from the crime scene itself. It would come from the technology surrounding the case. Surveillance footage. Phone records. Clues that couldn't be hidden, no matter how careful the killers had tried to be. The first discovery was the Walmart footage. Images of DeAndre Wallace and J.J. Rogers walking through the aisles, their faces clear as day as they purchased the very items used to stage the murder. They had been careful to use cash, but the cameras had caught everything. And then, there were the phone records. Calls between Marcus Carter and DeAndre Wallace stretching back weeks before the murder. The frequency of the calls. The timing. All of it suggesting that something far more deliberate was at play. Detectives began to piece together a disturbing picture. A plan set in motion by someone with motive. Someone who stood to gain everything from Monique's death. But even as evidence continued to build, something didn't feel right. And that feeling only intensified when detectives spoke to Marcus himself. During his initial interview, Marcus played the role of the grieving husband well. His voice trembled. His eyes red from what appeared to be tears. But there was something missing. Something critical. Not once did Marcus Carter ask who killed his wife. Not once did he demand to know who was responsible for the brutal murder of the woman he had spent 16 years of his life with. Instead, his concern seemed focused elsewhere. His demeanor was off. Like he was trying too hard to convince everyone around him of his sorrow. And for seasoned investigators, the act was all too familiar. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that connected Marcus to the crime. And for that, they needed to go deeper. And the more they dug, the more they realized that Marcus Carter's story was riddled with holes. Detectives were already suspicious of Marcus Carter. His strange behavior. His failure to ask the most basic question anyone in his position would ask. And most of all, the trail of phone calls that pointed directly to him. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed concrete proof. And it wouldn't take long before they found it. It started with the rental car. DeAndre and JJ had driven down from Missouri, believing their journey would go unnoticed. But technology had already begun to unravel their plan. The GPS data from the rental car placed them squarely in Bonita Springs on the night of the murder. Their path from Missouri to Florida was traced with precision. There was no denying they had been there. And once that information was confirmed, the investigation's focus narrowed. Phone records were next. Detectives pulled the call logs between Marcus Carter and DeAndre Wallace. What they found was a pattern impossible to ignore. Hundreds of calls and text messages in the weeks leading up to the murder. Conversations that were clearly not casual. Instructions. Coordination. And then, something even more telling. The calls between Marcus and DeAndre came to an abrupt halt on the night of June 28th. As if the mission was over. As if their business had been completed. That silence spoke louder than any words ever could. But still, Marcus insisted he was innocent. His grief played out for the cameras. His denial rehearsed with every interview. He believed he could still manipulate the situation, twist the narrative in his favor. But his downfall wouldn't come from the evidence detectives had gathered. It would come from the recklessness of his own accomplices. J.J. Rogers was never one to keep his mouth shut. The thrill of the crime, the blood on his hands, it was something he couldn't keep to himself. And it was his arrogance that would ultimately betray him. He bragged about the murder to his girlfriend. Details spilled out of his mouth as if the act had been nothing more than a twisted badge of honor. But instead of admiration, his words only filled her with disgust. Terrified by what she had heard, she made the call to the police. And the information she provided was more than enough to break the case wide open. The bloody clothes J.J. had been foolish enough to keep were soon recovered. Their DNA evidence matched to Monique Carter. And when confronted with the evidence, JJ folded under the pressure. His bravado crumbled, replaced by fear and desperation. But even then, he tried to save himself. Tried to bargain his way out of a life sentence by shifting the blame, claiming it was all DeAndre's idea. But the story he told only made things worse for Marcus. Because in his desperation to escape his own fate, JJ revealed something investigators had been waiting to hear. That DeAndre had been hired. That this wasn't some random act of violence. It was premeditated. A plot designed by Marcus Carter himself. Marcus's web of lies was starting to fall apart. And the investigators were now more determined than ever to put the final pieces of the puzzle together. With J.J. Rogers already in custody and his confession laying out the murder plot in chilling detail, the authorities turned their attention to DeAndre Wallace. They tracked him down in Missouri, his attempt to lay low proving to be nothing more than a desperate effort to delay the inevitable. When DeAndre was brought in for questioning, his arrogance was gone. His usual bravado had been replaced by a cold, quiet fear. The police had more than enough to connect him to the murder. The GPS data, the Walmart footage, the endless string of calls between him and Marcus Carter. But even with the mounting evidence against him, DeAndre refused to break. His silence was his last act of control. But when the threat of a life sentence without parole became a reality, his resolve began to crumble. The thought of spending the rest of his life behind bars was something he couldn't accept. And so, he made his choice. DeAndre confessed. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he told the investigators everything. How Marcus had approached him with the offer. How the plan had been designed to look like a robbery gone wrong. How Marcus had promised him $100,000 once the job was done. But DeAndre's cooperation didn't end there. He also told them about JJ's involvement. How he had recruited the younger man because he needed someone to help him carry out the plan. How JJ's recklessness had almost derailed everything. And most importantly, how Marcus Carter had orchestrated it all from the very beginning. With DeAndre's confession in hand, authorities turned their attention back to Marcus. They had all the evidence they needed. But even then, Marcus remained stubborn. He denied everything, insisting he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. His lies were as transparent as glass. But his denial couldn't save him. The charges against him were severe. First-degree murder. Conspiracy to commit murder. The very crimes he had tried so hard to distance himself from were now being laid at his feet. J.J. Rogers, already in police custody, had refused to cooperate. His arrogance and defiance were clear from the start. He had been so sure he could talk his way out of the situation. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. His girlfriend's testimony. The bloody clothes. The confession he foolishly shared in a moment of misguided pride. There would be no deals for JJ. His actions had spoken for themselves. And the court's decision was swift and unforgiving. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sentence that left him broken and defeated. But for Marcus, the stakes were even higher. The mastermind behind the plot. The man who had hired killers to take the life of his own wife. His attempts to deny his involvement only made him look more guilty. And when DeAndre took the stand, his testimony was the final nail in the coffin. Marcus Carter was arrested, his life of deceit and greed crashing down around him. The man who once believed he had orchestrated the perfect murder now found himself shackled and powerless. The evidence was undeniable. The testimonies were damning. And Marcus's desperate attempt to protect his own lifestyle had instead led him straight to his own destruction. But as the case was prepared for trial, one question still remained. Would justice truly be served? The trial of Marcus Carter became a spectacle. The courtroom filled with reporters, members of the community, and those who had once considered Marcus a respectable man. His calm demeanor, his attempts to appear innocent, all of it was about to be torn apart by the very people he had trusted to do his dirty work. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the mountain of evidence they had gathered. The phone records, the GPS data from the rental car, the surveillance footage from Walmart. It all painted a clear picture of premeditation. But the most damaging blow came when DeAndre Wallace took the stand. He sat in the witness box, his expression cold but resigned. His voice was steady as he recounted every detail of the plot Marcus had orchestrated. He spoke of the conversations they had, the money Marcus had promised, the instructions he had been given. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as DeAndre's words spilled out. The betrayal was now fully exposed. And then came the statement that would solidify Marcus's guilt. Marcus said she had to go. That she was worth more dead than alive. Those words echoed throughout the room, the weight of them pressing down on everyone present. Marcus's entire motive laid bare for the world to see. Greed. Control. And a cold calculation that left everyone disgusted. The defense tried to paint DeAndre as a liar. A criminal trying to save himself by pinning everything on Marcus. But the evidence was overwhelming. And Marcus's refusal to admit his guilt only made him appear even more desperate. As the trial continued, J.J. Rogers' fate was sealed just as quickly. His own words had already damned him. His attempts to play tough, to pretend he wasn't afraid of the consequences, had only made his conviction easier. The jury deliberated for less than a day before reaching their verdict. J.J. Rogers was found guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence? Life in prison without the possibility of parole. His arrogance had led him to ruin, and now he would spend the rest of his days locked away, his name nothing more than a reminder of a failed plan. But Marcus Carter's trial was far from over. The prosecution tore through his defense, piece by piece. Every attempt he made to defend himself was met with more evidence, more witnesses, more truth. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, there was no mercy to be found. Marcus Carter was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence was clear. Death. As the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, Marcus remained motionless. His expression unreadable, his eyes cold and empty. The man who had once tried to orchestrate the perfect murder now sat in chains, his life reduced to a few words spoken by a judge who saw right through his lies. The last images of Marcus in court showed him being led away in shackles, his face drained of any emotion. It was over. Everything he had planned, everything he had tried to manipulate, had crumbled to dust. But even then, the true tragedy was not in his downfall. It was in the life he had destroyed. The woman whose kindness and dedication had been repaid with betrayal and violence. And as Marcus Carter disappeared from the courtroom, his name became nothing more than a dark chapter in the history of Bonita Springs. Dr. Monique Carter dedicated her life to healing others. From her clinic in Bonita Springs, she offered hope and healing to countless patients. Her skill, her kindness, her passion for helping others, it was what made her so respected, so admired. But in the end, all of that wasn't enough to save her. The man she trusted. The man she built a life with. The man who stood beside her as her husband. He was the one who destroyed everything. Marcus Carter's greed, his desperation, his obsession with control, it all led to the unthinkable. A plot carried out with brutality and precision. A life taken without mercy. But even as Marcus sat rotting in prison, waiting for the day when his own life would end, the horror of what he had done continued to echo. The memories of Monique's laughter. The warmth she brought into the lives of everyone she met. All of it stolen away by a man who valued money and control above love and loyalty. They say the people closest to you are the ones you can trust the most. But for Monique Carter, that trust became her downfall. A husband who was willing to destroy her to save himself. A betrayal so deep it left an entire community shattered. Greed. Betrayal. Murder. Sometimes, the person sleeping next to you is the one planning your demise. And for Monique Carter, that terrible truth only came to light when it was far too late. Her smile, once so full of life, now only remains in photographs and memories. A haunting reminder of what was taken. and a warning of how easily trust can be twisted into something lethal. If you found this deep dive into the shocking murder of Dr. Monique Carter compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another true crime story. We cover the most chilling cases, uncovering the truth behind unimaginable betrayals and the darkness that hides in plain sight. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to us. Thank you for watching.